just needed a slightly different from what they are. We talk, we see things are not normal.
Welcome to Strange Familiars. How you doing, Alison?
Doing fine, Tim. And
Yes, I am late. Last week was I just scheduled too much. I literally just scheduled too much for myself, and I could not get the episode done.
in lieu of that, though, we got to have a nice visit with Josh.
Yeah. Josh flew up from Georgia. We spoke at the Paranormal Research Symposium in Gettysburg, which I would have promoted on the show last week, had we done a show last week.
Yeah, that's the best laid plans of mice and men.
Yeah. But even still, we had a good time. It's great to see Josh. Gave a talk on Bigfoot and Women in White, from Where the Footprints End. Had a good talk, had a good reception there at the Paranormal Research Symposium. Made some friends. So thanks everybody who was there, even though you didn't know it because of Strange Familiars. And afterwards, we went to Pond Bank and Camp Michaud.
To not camp, though, right?
No. No, both of those places should be familiar to our listeners as places we've gone before in Michaud Forest. Not a lot to report. I haven't listened to the tapes yet. The most exciting thing was running into, I didn't see them, but just from how many I heard, what seemed to be a massive pack of coyote.
Oh.
Like maybe the biggest pack of coyote I've ever run into.
Because you heard like distinct individual voices, kind of?
Yeah, and just overlapped, as like as they were going.
I love to hear them, but it's also very disconcerting.
When there's that many, yeah. I mean, they're really not an issue with, three of us in the woods. Like Octavian was there too. Mm-hmm. Three of us together in the woods, three grown men. I can't see them ever being an issue at that point. But, maybe if you were alone, that might be an issue.
Yeah,
a whole pack of them. Not much else happened. We thought we might have heard like a couple sounds that were like, what was that? Kind of thing. But we'll see what's captured on the recorder. We'll see if it's anything worth digging out.
Have you ever had one of those experiences where you go out and you thought nothing happened, you listen back on the tape and there's like a voice that's like, get out of here?
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, that sound I pressed by mistake right before we started. Uh-huh. I interviewed a guy at Pond Bank. That's from Pond Bank. Uh-huh. And I didn't hear that sound. And then when I went back to listen to the interview, that sound was underneath our entire interview. That's the only brief sound I caught of it. I love playing it, so I'm going to play it again. The whole time, just like a constant,
Is it frogs?
No, this was early March. It was freezing cold. Oh. And it was like Tuvan throat singing. Like I faded it out. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise you just hear talking,
Is it sustained?
Yeah, like Tuvan throat singing the entire time. Like there's pauses in it, but it's like I said, it's like Tuvan throat singing. It's just like a big long drone like that through the entire interview.
Oh, you need to do a song where you use that, like, and have that drone in the background.
I'm pretty sure I used it in Wilderness Geist.
Oh, okay.
I can't see that I wouldn't have. If not, I will. All right, Alison, I had very little to do with this week's show. This was your baby. Tell us what's happening here.
Well, you might have heard us. We did a little historical show where we did like a double feature, and I can't remember what the other person in the story was. Like, this is not that long ago.
It was the hermit who molested the girl, or potentially.
Yeah. The bad hermit.
The bad hermit.
Let's just say the bad hermit story. Yeah. The bad hermit, and then the story of Olive Oatman. I'm gonna be real honest with everybody. Like, sometimes I spend weeks and weeks and weeks doing research, and sometimes I spend less time.
Sometimes we need to get a show together.
Yeah, sometimes we need
and we have nothing else, and we need to like hammer out some research.
Yeah. So I do it quickly, and I should have done better research, and I should have read this book called The Blue Tattoo by Margo Mifflin, and luckily she must have heard the show and contacted us and said, do you want to talk about the real story? And I was like, yes, I want to talk about the real story. So Tim let me take over the reins and interview her, which is, not really my forte, but hope I did okay. To me, it's like if it's just like a regular conversation and Margo and I I felt like a really good rapport.
You had a lot in common.
We have
anyway,
a ton in common, and it was wonderful. And
and it's not just about Olive Oatman; it's about tattooing women in general.
Yeah. So not only did she write the book, The Blue Tattoo, about Olive Oatman, that was because she had initially written a book about women in tattooing. She's like sort of one of the groundbreaking writers about women in the history of tattooing. And so if you like that aspect of it, that's going to be a part of our conversation as well. You'll hear.
Well, before we get to your interview, I'd like to thank our patrons. Thank you so much, patrons. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for supporting Strange Familiars. We could not, and indeed would not, do the show without your help. If you'd like to help us make Strange Familiars and get extra content besides, you can become a patron at Patreon. It's patreon.com/strangefamiliars. All of our patrons get commercial-free versions of the weekly shows, plus full extra episodes monthly. We do one full episode at least for our patrons. Often we do more. Again, the address for that is patreon.com/strangefamiliars. There's also an option on Apple Podcasts. There it's called Patron of the Strange. Apple Podcast subscribers get the weekly shows commercial-free as well as the extra shows monthly. And I know there's been a pause in me adding the back patron shows to Apple. I will get them all up there. It takes so long to upload them to Apple. And I've been very, very busy trying to get my book out. So the full back catalog of Patreon episodes will be on Apple, but it's going to take me some time to get there. I've had years and years and years to put them up on Patreon.
Yeah.
I can't get them all up on Apple right away, but I'm doing my best. I'll try to add some more soon. And just a note, the entry-level price, which probably all the prices for all the tiers on Patreon is going to go up a little bit soon. So now's the time to get in there. If you get in now, it's $4 a month for the lowest tier. It gets you the extra content monthly. It helps us make the show. And if you get in at the current price, you'll be grandfathered in again, as long as Patreon lets us do that. It's Patreon's platform. We don't get to make those decisions, but so far they've let us do that since the beginning of the podcast. So as long as they let us keep you at that tier, you get locked in now at $4 a month. When the price raises, it'll stay there for as long as you keep paying $4 a month. I know I keep saying I'm going to do this. I just haven't had time. I'll probably do it whenever I get the Hermit's book ready to be published. So probably September now. I was planning on doing it this month, but it'll probably be September before I get to it. But still, good time to lock in at the lower rate on Patreon. Once again, thank you, patrons. Thank you so much. And now, let's get to your interview with Margo Mifflin.
Tonight we're talking to Margo Mifflin, and she reached out to us after our story about Olive Oatman to tell me about the real story behind Olive. And first of all, I'd like to offer my apologies for my hasty research. We were sort of down to the wire, and I had just gotten that carte de visite of Olive, and I knew the general background of it, and I did not go further than Royal Stratton's co-opting of Olive's message. And I wanted to know, first of all, if you could explain the major difference between what Mr. Stratton wrote about Olive's experience versus the reality of it.
Yes. So he was a Methodist minister who discovered her after her return, obviously, or after she was ransomed back from the Mojave. And she moved north with her brother, who she was reunited with after her captivity, her quote captivity, which in the end, in my view, was not captivity. The Mojave adopted her and raised her and were good to her, as she said. But in his story, he spun it. He initially just got rid of all the, I almost said Muslim, all the Mormon references. And obviously her family was Mormon, and they were going west on this Mormon wagon train. So he sort of cleared all that out, inserted his Methodist views in it, and claimed that what saved her, what made her able to survive these horrible savages, was her faith. And so he spun it as a religious tale when in fact, in her tellings, a lot of which were immediately after she was ransomed back. So nobody had interfered with her story. And even a colonel who interviewed her was very careful about how he asked her questions, because he noticed initially that when he asked her questions, she would say yes to the same question, whether it was framed in the positive or the negative.
Mm-hmm.
So then he started revising his questions to make sure he got solid answers, not just sort of congenial affirmation. The main thing he did was paint the Mojaves as these horrible, violent people who were not interested in her welfare, and basically tattooed her as a captive.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a main error among many. But the main thing was the religious angle, the depiction of the Mojave, and then the things he left out are the things that I was able to use to determine that she actually wanted to be there and they were good to her.
Where was the best primary source material for like her? I mean, I read like her letter to her aunt. Was it her aunt about her marriage? And was there an abundance of actual letters of hers that you were able to access?
There were not a lot, and the most frustrating thing was that she had no diary, and somewhere along the way, somebody told me about a guy in California who had a box in his attic that had all this Oatman stuff in it. And I tried to find this guy and never could. But there were a couple things that were useful. One was the newspaper sources where she gave interviews before Stratton got a hold of her. So I was able to A-B. I sort of explain it at the beginning of the book, the way I A-B'd his story with hers and accepted what he said that made sense with what she said, and also with what was happening historically at that period. But then where I was able to determine where he went off track was primarily to prove the point that she wanted to be with them. There was the tattoo, there was a nickname that she was given, Sponsa, that both of which confirmed her membership rather than her as a captive who was held by them. But in answer to your question, one of the most important sources was interviews I did with Mojave elders in the 1990s. I went to talk with them in this little trailer that was their cultural center at the time. It actually may still be. I haven't been back, but they confirmed, first of all, that she never had children, that it would have been known if she had children, which was a rumor that followed her her whole life and periodically still gets revived. Second of all, that she wouldn't have been tattooed as a captive. And in the book, I even do reference her observing captives within the Mojave tribe who were not tattooed. And she was tattooed. And that was part of an initiation ritual that confirmed her membership with them. And then the third thing that Mrs. Barrickman, the couple that I interviewed their name was Barrickman, she confirmed that this name Sponsa that Oatman was given as a nickname would only have been given to her as an insider. It was a very raunchy name.
Yeah. I was because so much of the sort of prurient nature of the potential of her story, which is untold, when you actually get a little piece of like what everyone wants to sort of ask, but cannot feel like they're able to ask. When you get a little piece of that, I was shocked, I have to say.
It is shocking. And it's so funny because when she was ransomed back, the question on everyone's mind was she violated? Is she a lady or is she not? And that was important to her destiny in the sense that people didn't really want to know her story I can't say they didn't, but the affirmation that she was not raped made her able to survive this as a lady who merited saving and, funding by like charities that came to her aid when she came back because she had no family but her brother. So, you know, in her day, people are wondering what happened. Little did they know what this name that was on the travel pass that she used when she was ransomed back identified her by. So the name was Spansa, S-P-A-N-T-S-A. And so what it meant, how it translated literally was rotten vagina. So initially, like 50, 60 years ago, linguists who looked at this thought, you know, maybe she was menstruating when she came to the Mojave. And they were very clean and swam in the river every day and may have thought, you know, this woman who's been traveling with these people, although she had been with another tribe for a year before that.
Mm-hmm.
But surely the Mojave thought that pioneers who came through, who were few in the days before Oatman, were a pretty grimy lot because they'd been on wagon trains and not eating and, you know, just had a different standard compared to them. That the theory was that they thought she was menstruating. That would explain her being dirty in that sense. But the word translated to rotten vagina more in a sexual way, implying she was very sexually active. And the Mojave were very free sexually. So there was no judgment there. It was sort of just a fun, you know, diss on her for possibly having been very sexually active. And there were people theorized too that she had a husband, but there's not really any evidence. It's confirmed to me that there would have been evidence if she'd been married.
Mm-hmm.
So
you would think it has more of a humorous tone than a pejorative kind of name for her, and it doesn't speak to her otherness on any level.
I don't think so, because these names that they used, as far as we know, were affectionate. They were raunchy, but they were affectionate and fun. They weren't designed to really hurt anyone. And they were indications of inclusion.
Yeah, that's curious to me when you said she witnessed other people that were held captive. And what do you think the difference was why they were captives and she was ultimately brought into the sort of the familial fold?
Well, they were held as captives of war because the tribes in the region were periodically warring with each other. And she came to them because she had been taken in this assault on her family, who had peeled off from the bigger Mormon wagon train as they moved towards California, where they imagined that there was going to be this paradise for them. They were traveling with guides written by people who had never been there. Sort of imagined what it was like.
It's kind of adolescence in a nutshell, right? You're going to a place you've never been, but with guides who have barely more knowledge than you have.
Right. And they describe it as it's going to be this lush green place where
in the desert,
it's incredible vegetation and fruit and vegetables. I have no idea that you're in the desert where they're going. So anyway, they're traveling west. They're attacked by a tribe called the Yavapai, who I don't know what their story was. They lived in the mountains. They may have been fed up with the flood of people who had started coming west. The Oatmans were traveling in 1851 at that time. And of course, 48 was when the gold rush happened. And so appears they were just hungry because they asked first for food, and Oatman's father, who was worried about getting where he was going alone in the desert and had had 7 children and another one on the way, was worried that his food wouldn't hold out. So they attacked, killed the whole family except for Olive and her little sister. And they didn't know that a brother who was left for dead had survived. So how she got to the Mojave was that she and her sister lived with the Yavapai, where they were sort of treated as slaves and worked and had a very unhappy existence. And the Mojave, who traded with the Yavapai, felt sorry for these girls. And the daughter of the chief, whose name I'm forgetting now, he was Espineo. I'm blanking on her name, but she persuaded her father to take them back. And so they went with her returned to the, or not returned, but met the tribe, were adopted by the tribe. And the couple who adopted her did treat her and her sister as their own and raise them. And the evidence of that is that when they hit a really terrible drought and a famine in which her sister died, her Mojave mother realized their situation was dire and gave Olive food to survive that she hadn't given her own children, because she realized she was really on the brink of death and would die as her sister had if she didn't help her. And furthermore, her mother, when she was being ransomed back 4 years later, and the Mojave didn't want to give her back and considered her one of them, and were threatened by the U.S. Army, who said one way they got her was by saying, "You've seen so many white people in your life, but in fact, there are millions of us in the mountains around you, and if you don't give her to us, we'll come declare war on you and take her." So they didn't know, and they finally gave her up, but they didn't want to. It took like a whole night of negotiating and resisting for them to finally make the decision. And when it happened, her mother cried and didn't want her to leave.
And it wasn't because of a loss of like a perceived asset on their part. It was because of their familial relation.
Yes, absolutely. They'd become attached to her just as she'd become attached to them. But she couldn't say a lot of this when she first returned, which is how Stratton got involved. It was not considered ladylike for her to say that she had lived happily among, quote, savages, or that she had lived like a savage, riding, topless on horses through the countryside and swimming naked in the Colorado River. And so she had to, I don't know that she knew how to edit her story when she first told it, but Stratton certainly knew how to put the brakes on anything that was going to make her look less than a good Christian who survived the terrible savages that she was taken by.
Yeah, I think my major question, and the thing that I keep sort of, maybe it's an unfair parallel, but how much agency did she have, and how much was her sort of complicitness with any sort of order she found? Like if she found people that were taking care of her, were they her family because she felt the same kind of affection you would for another family? Or was it because this was something that was working in the moment and she had to just go with the flow? Or did she really, because if this narrative was attached to, say, an enslaved person who was ripped away from their family bonds in Africa and brought to the United States, would we talk in the same terms about, someone who might want to return to a plantation at some point or being happy there? And I know it gets into these very kind of nuanced relationships where these things can exist at the same time. You might not have agency, but you may also have a nuanced, caring relationship between people. And so how did you come to the realization that that was kind of truly where her heart was?
Yeah, I mean, it's different in the sense that she wasn't mistreated by the Mojave. So they built her trust. And it's not to say she didn't miss her family. I think part of it is that she didn't think any of her family existed anymore, of her immediate family. She knew that she had aunts and uncles back in Illinois. And then she went and lived with cousins in Oregon when she was ransomed back. But I think the main thing is that she was torn. On one hand, she did want to see her family, and she had, PTSD from seeing her family massacred. And that was something she struggled with her whole life. But because the Mojave were good to her, and she had her sister with her too, which helped, that they could establish themselves among the Mojave together. And they were given a little plot of land to plant and grow things in. It's funny that Stratton would let some things bleed through his narrative, like her telling her sister when they left the Yavapai and arrived with the Mojave, that her sister said to her, "Oh, this is really beautiful here. I could see staying here for a while." They had a good feeling about it. And certainly, just in a material sense, the Mojave were in a much better place than the Yavapai were, basically because they lived on the Colorado River And so life was easier, planting was easier.
Just a more fertile area. Generally.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess in answer to your question, it's partly about the fact that they were treated well, and so their trust was cultivated, and also that she trusted them. She didn't think she had family elsewhere. And so I forget, your question was, how did I determine?
Yeah, how did you determine that? Because I know if there are a lot of people who kind of use that narrative when they're talking about chattel slavery to talk about how, well, sometimes there were masters who were good to their enslaved population. Right. And I think just because like I'm involved in that world in another capacity, like I think about things in that terms. And I think when people say that to me, it rings as like an excuse for the horrors of slavery. And I always say, like, but if you have no agency, it really doesn't matter how nice people are treating you. Like if you have, you know, like, so I think that's what I struggle with. And she may very well have found that, you know, like a beautiful, wonderful place where she did find family. But how much agency did she really have? Like, I mean, I can't imagine even in 2024, someone who was taken captive being able to know the logistics of how to make their own escape. You know, it's like,
yeah. And yet I do talk in the book about some opportunities she did have to escape. Now, I know that some people will say, like in comment threads, she obviously had Stockholm syndrome and she wouldn't have left because she couldn't have left. But the combination of the way they treated her, the fact that they tattooed her and she didn't resist, and the tattoo was sort of an initiation ritual and an expression of inclusion in the sense that the tattoos marked you so that your ancestors could recognize you in the afterlife. And so she didn't resist, like the tattoo lines are clean. Now that could be because she was psychologically compromised in some way. But all these things together, the nickname, the good treatment, the going from a tribe that did exploit her to a tribe that treated her well was significant in all that.
Yeah, and I think maybe the parallel really is those incredibly complicated, nuanced relationships between people who have agency and don't, and how you can still, you know, you can still very much love a child that you're taking care of, even if you're enslaved.
I'm just trying to process the analogy. The child you're taking care of.
Say, perhaps if you're
a white child.
Yeah, if you're an enslaved person who's taking care of a white child who you desperately love and care for and think of as your family, but also having no agency to leave that situation in any real respect.
Yeah, it's true. And there's, again, like I do think it's different because she wasn't technically enslaved, but I see that the point that you're making, and there's some margin of we'll never know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then what I worry about is like, are we like with our own 2024 sensibilities co-opting Olive's narrative once again by deciding for her?
But you know, there are so many examples of captives some of whom wrote captivity narratives who didn't want to return, that she's not isolated. Especially I forget what the age is. I think I mentioned in the book, but there's a sort of window when children are taken when they're more likely to acculturate and want to return. I think it's like 8 to 14 or something.
When you think of really truly coming of age and how much those sort of end of childhood memories, beginning of being an adolescent, how crystal clear they are in your own memory. And how you return to those days and those thoughts and think of yourself in comparison to how you are now, and how that's sort of the beginning of it all. I mean, I can see being very nostalgic for that, especially if you lived in an incredibly permissive society and then went back to a very regimented Victorian world where you had less agency in that respect too, as a woman.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she suffered, and did she suffer because of the trauma she had been through with her family being killed, or did she suffer because she had lost two families, her biological family and her Mojave family? It's hard to know. Oh, and I didn't quite finish the point about Stratton, and self-editing. There was a lot she probably knew she couldn't say, having come, reached age 13 in white society, about what had happened to her. And then there was what Stratton suppressed because he didn't think it would sell, basically, if he wrote her story and put her on the lecture circuit, which he did. And she did have a certain level of agency in the sense that initially he was the one telling the story and she was just there. People wanted to see the tattoo and they wanted to know the story. But at some point he realized she's better at this than I am. She told the story and people really responded. So she became the speaker. There was one thing I meant to tell you relating to the photograph you had of her in it's like a black dress with a seam up the arm. In the book, there's a photograph of her on the lecture circuit in a dress with hash marks on the hem and on the sleeve that echo the pattern of the tattoo. And what interested me about your photo is that I hadn't seen her photographed quite at this angle where there's a seam down the arm, and the tattoos that were never photographed of her were on her vertical lines on her upper arms. So that just seemed like a really interesting echo of that hash mark dress that echoed her tattoos as well.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too, because that particular photo was taken in Chatham in New York City, which is like the renowned place for sideshow photography. So this is probably going to get into the interesting sort of second part of our discussion that Margo was the pioneering woman to talk about women in tattooing. And so that was the thing that really surprised me is when I started to read the Stratton narrative as sort of like a circus pitch book, which is what it is. And that her entire story presages tattooed women for the next 30, 40 years. Like she's the blueprint for sideshow tattooed women, totally unbeknownst to her. And so she's probably having her photo taken right before and distributed right before the first tattooed women meet on the scene. I want to just put a pinpoint in that because we didn't talk too much about her life when she gets married and her sort of third family. And I wanted to talk about some of the health problems that she had and the very symbolic, I thought it was sort of tragically symbolic that she had problems with her sight from a young age.
Yes.
I just thought that was so
she had seen too much.
Yeah. She just couldn't bear to see anymore.
And she had these headaches and she would go to these rest cures in Canada, these water cures to try to help. I think mainly with the headaches, but it's hard to know if these are all independent health issues, the eyes, the headaches, and then the PTSD. Someone in Oregon described her pacing at night and crying. And, we don't know who she was crying for or what she was crying about, but she certainly had plenty of trauma behind her to cry about. And so these physical manifestations of this are really touching.
And even the fact that for whatever reason, after she's married, she's not able to carry a child of her own. And so it's sort of like a loss of another family, another biological family, which I found incredibly, her whole family just dealt with so much, her brother losing family sons. And it was just this, just a life of constant loss, which I know is not unusual in the Victorian era, but it seemed she seemed to have a particularly, perhaps the roughest time of anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And a doctor was at a book club appearance I was doing who suggested that it may be that she couldn't have a biological child because she had experienced such extreme hunger during that drought that can render women infertile, which I had, when I wrote the book, I wasn't aware of that. But then that she went on, I love the sort of rhythm of she was adopted by the Mojave, ripped from them, married a man whose brother had been captive himself, and then couldn't have a biological child and adopted a child, which is so beautiful in light of how she was adopted.
Yeah, especially that part where you were talking about how she really wanted her mother at the time when her adopted daughter became the same age she was when she lost her mother, and how that was such a critical time for her and probably triggered a lot of those same emotions in her,
Yeah.
and perhaps the headaches as well, like.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be. And she had this opportunity to go back and see Arateba,
Mhm.
one of the, I forget if his title was chief, but a Mojave chief who went to Washington to see Lincoln. And she made sure she went to see him and reconnected with him. So there was some little bit of reunion there, but that was it. And I think she probably sensed that she couldn't push to go back there
Yeah.
because, again, as a Victorian lady, it wasn't considered appropriate to want to go back and visit with the tribe that had supposedly held her captive.
And so she's freed and she's doing the rounds. And then we're, 20 years away from the early 1880s when Nora Hildebrandt and Irene Woodward make their debut with their accompanying pitch pamphlets, which read like a retelling of Olive's story.
Yes, so many stories of Indian savages, and it always cracks me up that the tattoos are completely Western.
Yeah.
Patriotism and American flags and stuff.
And banners with and Irene especially with her adopted name on it, like her stage name. And
yeah, and one of them, I forget who it was, but got around that by saying she was forced to have her father tattoo, that the Indians forced the father to tattoo her. So that might explain why she didn't have indigenous imagery or designs.
Yeah, it's interesting too that in no part of their pitch books do they ever appear as women who made the choice to go and get tattooed. It was always completely out of their hands, something forced upon them. Is that to make them an object of acceptable pity, maybe, or acceptable? The gaze is more acceptable than someone who would choose to do that. Because certainly you wouldn't want to give that person, like, now you can look at them in a sort of a pitiable sense, as opposed to looking at them for what they really are, which is a curiosity, a self-made freak, to use the terminology of the day.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I guess that didn't endure for too long. It was only a couple of decades, maybe a decade before women made it clear that they were getting tattooed for professional reasons to present themselves in the early 20th century, I guess. But yeah, in that period, they had to sort of fudge it by pretending it was imposed on them. Yeah. And often when they were actually tattooed by husbands or fathers.
Yeah, there's some, I would say, confounding relations between some of the tattooees and the tattooers at that time, like what their real relationship was, which is hard to parse, I think, especially like in Nora's case. And well, we're dealing with people in the circus sideshow who are living on absolutely the borderlands of propriety. So they're often married at the same time, and they're skirting laws of, frequently they're interracial marriages. There's bigamy frequently. There is, so we're not dealing with people who are living within the confines of polite Victorian society anyway. So
right, but they're trying to toe the line.
But they're trying to toe the line and just get away with enough to be, there's just enough of a leg showing to show some of it, but you're not going to see all of it. You're going to see a knee, right, or you're going to see, and which is still, really rather scandalous. The costume, I think, is maybe when Irene makes her debut with the gold spangles and the black, I think it's a black velvet suit or something with gold spangles in it. That makes makes the papers,
Yeah, and just the fact that these women were showing so much skin. Mm-hmm. Now, it was covered in the sense that it was tattooed, but in that period, it was shocking to show that much skin. And it was still a time when like having your skirt rise above your ankle was considered scandalous. So they were also towing the line between we're not bad women, but we have to strip down to show you what happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Like as I say in the book, it was both a freak show and a peep show.
Yeah,
you had the skin show and the novelty of the tattoos.
Yeah, and then if you wanted to really double up, you could hold a snake. So with the very subtle symbolism there.
Yeah. And yet some people did. I mean, I think the fact that some of them were tattooed by their husbands also protected them. They were allied with a man. And even early women tattooists were taught by their husbands. So later on, there was a bit of a breakthrough when women just started doing it on their own. After I wrote we're going backwards here. My first book was Bodies of Subversion, A Secret History of Women in Tattoo, which is a feminist history of tattoo art, which then led me to the Oatman story, which I discovered after writing that book. But there was a period an artist I discovered after writing Bodies of Subversion who, and I think it was the late teens or 20s, was a female tattooist in Virginia who advertised for female artists saying, I don't want any women who are taught by husbands or work with husbands. You need to be on your own.
Oh, wow.
And it's amazing. And she doesn't just want one, she wants multiple that she intends to employ. So because I discovered her after I wrote the book, I didn't do a whole lot more research into her, and I probably should, but
that seems like a whole nother book.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe I did try to research her, but I just couldn't find that much more on her. I don't know how far she went, but that was pretty radical to be on your own in that period and wanting to work only with women was rare.
And was she serving primarily like the circus and performing side, or was she doing like sort of polite hidden tattoos for socialites, or was she just serving women generally, or did she have a male audience as well?
It's a great question. I'm thinking if she was in Virginia, I don't know. She might have, had military clients, but I don't think she was probably primarily tattooing women, because there just weren't that many women then to fuel a whole business.
I'll prove to you, I did buy both the books, so I have them here.
Oh, thank you. Oh,
it reminded me because it took me back to, I think the first time I sort of became aware of, sort of the burgeoning tattoo, modern primitives kind of era was with the research books, called Modern Primitives, like in the late 80s and early 90s, when that was more of like an underground kind of thing. It was sort of bubbling up at the same time that like punk rock was gaining its sort of, what's the right term for it? Commercialization or
yeah.
And so it like the underground was sort of bubbling to the surface, and I became aware of that at that time. And so it would have been good for me to have your book at that time, but here we are 30 years later.
And it's funny you mentioned the research books, because the first edition of Bodies of Subversion, which precedes the one you have, it was published by Juno Books, and Andrea Juno, and gosh, I've forgotten the name of her collaborator at Research Publications. They were a team. And then she spun off on her own, and she published Bodies of Subversion under Juno, her imprint, or her publishing company.
Oh, that's great, because it just so reminded me of looking through the book. And I think my husband and I probably had it because of we were big Psychic TV fans. So there was pictures of Genesis in it at the time, and that was totally new to me, living in rural Pennsylvania. I did not know. I mean, there could very well have been people who were heavily tattooed and pierced that I had no conception of, but it wasn't the sort of cultural moment that it became. Then your book was republished and you added like an addendum to it as well, right?
Yeah. So it just came back to me. It was V. Vale who worked with Andrea as research. And so I guess it was 97 when the first edition was published. And it was Betty Broadbent was on the cover. She was a great tattooed woman, circus performer who she's great because she merges a third world of mine, which is my most recent book, Cultural History of the Miss America Pageant. She was a woman who turned up at the World's Fair in a beauty pageant, heavily tattooed, fully tattooed. She knew she wasn't going to win, but she just did it to get out there and, tattoos. And it really took guts and confidence. So anyway, 97 was the first edition. Then I updated it in 2001 and again in 2013. So the one you have is fuller, a little more updated. There's a few things I took out that now I kind of wish I hadn't. So maybe someday I'll put them back in.
Yeah, definitely. That was the thing I also noticed, is that how tattooing is really a window to the culture at the time. And it's because it is permanent. It really keeps you in that moment, in that time. And when I see these pictures, I was like, I can tell you probably exactly within like a 3 to 5 year range when this work was done. Like when you see tattoos from the 80s, you know they're tattoos from the 80s. When you see like people who have tattoos in the 70s that I knew, like they definitely follow a particular pattern. And I think what I'm probably curious about too is like the women during times of extreme, sort of like the 50s, when you have these like extreme turns towards uber femininity and compliance. Like what do women in the 50s look like? Because that seems to be sort of like a lost time.
Yeah, I guess like for a number of women, it was underground, but it always existed. And even in the 50s, there was a really remarkable woman, Elizabeth Weinzierl. She started really in the late 40s. She was the wife of a doctor who saw tattoos in medical journals and was interested in them. She decided to get tattooed. I think maybe he asked her initially if she would get tattooed, but then she got hooked and kept getting more and more tattooed. So she was a perfectly middle class, upper middle class woman married to a doctor who got heavily tattooed, not as a circus performer and not for any performative reason. She did it because she loved the tattoos. So that was an interesting transition out of the circus ladies era into the women doing it for their own reasons era.
Into that sort of self-empowerment kind of era. Yeah, and I really love that your book touched on people were getting tattoos as sort of, women who had mastectomy scars that they were covering up with something beautiful, making something beautiful out of a trauma. And I think that's a lost, not that it's a lost art, but it's not what you were you're not supposed to see those things. Those are personal reasons, and maybe that's the difference between like the sideshow performers and then women who got tattoos later, is that it really was just a personal decision. It wasn't to try to improve their financial lot. It wasn't an occupation.
Yeah. And when I initially was writing the book, I discovered I had been writing about visual art and then was interested in other art forms that were less legitimate, like tattooing and nail art. I was also kind of interested in nail art. So the gender applications of it were really interesting to me. The mastectomy tattoos, people who were survivors of sexual abuse who got tattooed to like redefine their bodies, to like recreate themselves beyond the abuse. I teach a course called Tattoos in Literature, Tattoos as Literature. So the first half is tattoos in stories and novels and how they function as symbols or what their role is. But the second half is how tattoos are narratives on the body and what they say. And there's just always so much great gender expression through them. One of my students who's trans did a piece on trans tattoos as expressions of gender affirmation. Another student did a paper on Medusa tattoos, which I hadn't known people get as expressions to confirm that they're survivors of abuse. And so this paper was documenting that, but then also documenting people who got Medusa tattoos without realizing that's what it signals to other people.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? And so then one person she wrote about was a man who got the Medusa because he liked the Medusa, then discovered this, but actually had been the victim of sexual assault. So he was weighing, do I have to say this publicly because I got this tattoo now, and ultimately decided to do it.
Wow.
But just the layers and layers of symbolism and accidental messaging and reclaiming the messaging is always so interesting.
Yeah, that reminds me so much of like the men who, when they would, like particular Navy sailors, when they would cross and get earrings, and how that was sort of like a subversive thing, but it was also a sign that you had accomplished something that most people had not. It made you sort of marginalized, but at the same time, it was an affirmation of something you had done that other people had not. And there's so much like seafaring imagery involved in that. And it's just fascinating to me how people that are sort of constantly flowing on either sides of the margins of what is polite society are the most fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Even one woman I interviewed for the book who held the Guinness record as the most tattooed woman at the time, her name was Kristen Colorful. She's since died. But even she had limits. Like she told me, I would never get my face tattooed. To me, that's where you're changing your identity. You're not just embellishing your body. And she was someone who was abuse survivor and tattooed initially for that reason, but also just fell in love with tattoos and wanted to collect from great tattooists like Ed Hardy. And so it was interesting to me that she would only go so far. Whereas today you see facial tattoos in the place.
Yeah, it is interesting to see how even what we consider to be sideshow photography is just very commonplace. Like when I looked at, when I first initially got into the sideshow photography in this area, and the Circassian women, like it was like that's what we used to do in the 80s. We just spray our hair up. It wasn't stale beer, but we like a lot of hairspray, and we'd wear striped tights and little slips instead of actual clothing. And it was we unbeknownst to us, we were mocking people from 100 years ago who were doing it and getting paid. And like, I think of I know you thanked Robert Bogdan in the beginning of your book, who was one of the foremost authorities on sideshow photography and one of the kindest people I've ever met. He used to come to the postcard show that happens in York every year.
Oh, wow. And I've never met him in person. He just helped me, I think, with images.
Yeah, he's such a kind man, and he would just kind of sit there and along with all these other postcard dealers, and I went up to him and I said, it was like meeting a rock star, and I was like, can you please sign my Freaks book? And then he was the first person to show me, he had photos of some circus giants in the picture, and he said, do you know who that is in between those two circus giants? I said, no, I don't know. And he said, that's Charles Eisenman. That's the photographer. And he was the first one to show me him. And then that opened up a world to me, because every time I saw other people that are used like for juxtaposition and height, frequently they're the photographers, or they're the photographer's assistants or operators. And so it was a great window into like research I was doing as well. And I love that he was one of the first people to talk about the agency that people got from displaying themselves. Like instead of giving it away for free to people who are going to mock you, you might as well make some money off of it,
That's amazing. So, and Eisenman was the one who was on Broadway or the Bowery?
Yeah, he's in the Bowery. Yeah, he's the foremost, quote unquote, freak photographer. And then Obermiller and Kern. And then in York, the Swords Brothers and Bransby Pence are the big sideshow photographers.
I have to see that photo when we get off. If you could direct me, I'd love to see it.
Oh, yeah. I can. Yeah, he's a little portly fellow, and in juxtaposition, the circus giants looks to be about 5 feet tall, but he may be a little larger. I might be misrepresenting him.
That's so great.
I took some time today to read some of your other articles, which I loved. You have a beautiful writing style, which I the one you wrote about your mother and your IUD, and it was.
It's all over the place.
All over there. And then also about your love of the Scarlet Letter, which I thought, like, was that not like a wonderful prescient kind of early influence?
Yeah. And do you say that because of the Dimsdale's, some might consider it a tattoo that appears on him in the end? They're like, did you read it? Do you remember, or did you read it recently enough that you remember the plot? Because I know a lot of people.
I have not read it Probably since high school.
Well, what I'm getting at is that, she has to wear the scarlet letter because she's had an affair with the minister, and he won't step up and say he did this, even though they're in love with each other. And now this is a spoiler, so anybody who intends this has to plug their ears for a minute. But at the end, when they step up finally at the center of town and reveal what they've done, there's this, I'm trying to think of how Hawthorne describes it. The minister feels this searing on his chest, and it's not very specifically described, but it appears that a brand or something appears on his chest. And you have to wonder, is it an A, like her scarlet letter that she was forced to sew onto her cloak to wear as an adulterer? And so he's got the same thing. But on some level, it's also a tattoo because it's on his skin. It's not on his cloak like hers is. So you can read the scarlet letter sort of in tandem with Moby Dick and all the wonderful tattoo symbol, not just symbolism, but imagery in there as a tattoo that was manifested on the minister after this, or a brand, I guess.
Kind of right back to Olive. Although, she couldn't take hers off. She couldn't.
Right. Yeah.
And
she wore that little veil when she moved towards, not the end of her life, but when she married and settled down in Sherman, Texas. She sometimes, even though everybody knew she had the tattoo, she sometimes wore a little veil that went I don't know if it went, I've seen a picture of it. I don't know if it goes across the top of her lip or just the top of her chin to cover the tattoo. And that's another strange thing in her story. Her tattoo was so public.
Yeah, everyone knew. What was the point of that?
Yet she felt the need to cover it sometimes. And sometimes wore makeup in photos that covered it too. So I'm sure her comfort and ambivalence, her comfort about the tattoo and her ambivalence about it lasted a lifetime. I'm sure it was never truly comfortable to be a Victorian lady wearing a chin tattoo.
But the first time I saw a photo of her in person, the National Portrait Gallery, I think in 2019, had an exhibit, and ironically, she and Lucretia Mott were in the same exhibit. And that was the first.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and it was the first time I saw an amber. I had seen a CDV of her before, but I'd never seen the amber types, and you can tell she's so young. She still has the baby fat and a little bit on her cheeks. And it's amazing that the clarity of because, tattoos are so famously hard to capture in film of that era. Well, in the early photographic processes, depending on the color, it would be difficult. Although I think blue would be better than if it were yellow or something. Well, yellow would turn black. Let's see. Blue might actually be one of the harder things because light blue doesn't show up in daguerreotypes very easily. So it's curious. I always wondered who the photographer was of some of those early amber types, and how early did they start taking photos of her? Was it the day she got back, they wheeled the closest photographer in to get her picture taken?
Yeah. I mean, I think it couldn't have been because I don't think photos were taken of her in California and Oregon. I think it was only on the East Coast. So it must have been at least a year afterwards.
Okay. And what was the year she was back?
It was 1850. Wait a sec. She went 1851 to 1857. She was ransomed back.
Oh, okay. So that's very early on in amber typing. So if that would have been one of the first years they would have been able to even do amber types if she were photographed in that first year or so.
Oh, interesting. So possibly she could have not been able to be photographed in the first year. It would have taken till she got to the East Coast.
Yeah, I mean, amber type kind of is 1850. I think the patent's either 1854 or 1856. But in general use, they're still using daguerreotypes, and so if she's gotten an amber type image taken, and I believe the one that I saw at the National Portrait Gallery, the matte on it appears as if it's maybe early 1860s. Does that make more sense? Is that when she's on tour?
Yeah. I think she started in 58 or 9.
Oh, okay. That probably is more consistent with those photos. Do you think she sold her images for profit?
I can't remember. I have to go back and read my own book because I don't if I mention it in there, but I don't think so. Oh, they sold Stratton's book.
Oh, okay. That would be the moneymaker. And was there a sense that she got any of that money that they split it, or did he take the lion's share?
I assume she did. I'm pretty sure she did. I can't remember why what evidence I have for that, but she and he were sort of, had a decent relationship up to a certain point, and then they drifted. And she didn't invite him to her wedding, and at some point he was in touch with her brother, but not Olive. So I don't know what happened, if she needed to shake free of him, or if he actually exploited her in a way that backfired and she pulled away from him, or if she just, once she got married, she wanted to put that behind her. I know her husband burnt all these copies of her book, of the Stratton book, because he didn't want her to be associated with this anymore. So who knows if the pressure was from him for her to disconnect from Stratton or what. It's not clear.
And there was no sense that she would want to do a rewrite with her version of
Yeah, I wish.
Yeah.
I was playing a game with somebody recently about people you'd want to, sort of like that New York Times book review section question, who would you want to have dinner with from history? And I mean, the implication there is it's going to be writers, but it's too hard a question for me to ask, but I would love to meet her just to say what really happened. And was I true to your story, or what did I get?
Yeah.
And what is there that we don't know? What was in that trunk of that guy in California? Was it a diary? And, there's so much missing that it is frustrating not to know.
Oh, yeah. Having worked on a project for so long, it is sort of comforting to know, more things bubble up every day. And, what you don't know today in 3 months could be totally upended, and your whole opinion could change on a particular topic. And that's what I think that's the one lovely thing about living in the world today, is that we do have so much access just from our homes to amazing research possibilities, of which I should have taken the time to do before I initially did the episode. So my profuse apologies on that. But
no worries.
Thank you for reaching out, because then I got to read this amazingly lovely book, which I'm going to plug now, called The Blue Tattoo, The Life of Olive Oatman by Margo Mifflin, which I absolutely wholeheartedly, I mean, it's just a wonderful, captivating is probably a poor choice of words, captivating read. I think it has so many layers of interest for people who love the quote unquote Wild West, who love history, who love the Victorian era, who love feminist thought, even people who love tattoos. And I love the fact that people who collect and are interested in tattooing are interested in Olive as sort of the forebearer of all of this. That she's the mother of tattoos,
Yeah, or at least in white society.
Yeah.
Keeping in mind that for thousands of years, indigenous communities have practiced tattooing. And there's a lot of interesting stuff coming up with tattoo tools being discovered, like in Tennessee, the various tools that go back, I forget how many thousands of years. So I feel like that, there's a great book coming out by Lars Krutak, who's a tattoo anthropologist, on the revival of indigenous tattooing around the world. I think it's coming out next spring with Yale, maybe. So that's nice. And speaking of my students, I have to say, I notice a lot of them. It used to be when I taught this course on tattoos and literature, tattoos as literature, they had this idea that tattooing was all Americana. Now I notice as the years go by, they're much more informed, and a lot of people are learning about indigenous practices on TikTok. So there you go. It's
full circle moment. My husband wants to ask a quote unquote silly question.
I'm sure.
Does she have any tattoos?
Do you have any tattoos?
Oh, I don't. It's funny when you were talking about being able to place tattoos historically, like from bodies of subversion, being able to tell when they were done. This is kind of the reason I'm not tattooed. When I was researching, I would fixate on some artist or some design, want it. And then a year or two later, initially it was journalistic neutrality. I thought, I can't do this while I'm writing about it. But I noticed the cycles of things I loved. And then a year or two later, I thought, oh my God, that's such a cliche. I'm so glad I didn't get that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Likewise, I don't think it's a failure for commitment. I mean, I've been married for close to 30 years. It's not that I can do it in interpersonal relationships, but like, I look back at glasses I had 10 years ago and think, what was I thinking? So I'm so glad that I never got tattoos, but also I always felt like sort of a sense of, what if I needed to escape somewhere and, someone could identify me by my tattoos? It's like, because, I can always cut my hair and dye it blonde or something if I needed to change my look. But if I have like some kind of very obvious tattoo, you can't really get away as easily.
It's true. On the other hand, if you were lost somewhere and needed to be identified, your tattoo can help. So I'm always about to get tattooed, but I'm also terribly indecisive. So who knows? I think it will happen. I just don't know when it'll happen. And
yeah, I would have to be something related to something that I know is permanent, like my kids or something,
Right. Yeah.
Something I'm not going to regret.
My daughter tattoos a little bit, so she and I are always about to get like complementary tattoos together, but we like different styles. So we're trying to find the intersection, or just do it without getting the same design.
Yeah.
Just get tattoos at the same place.
Yeah, but I like the idea of the theoretical tattoo sleeves. I always thought like it would be fantastic to have all the different photographers' signatures that were at the bottom of cabinet cards, like or the back marks of Victorian cabinet cards would look amazing. But for someone else,
that's a good image for you, and nobody has that. You should do it.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I'm past the window. I don't know. Am I past this?
You never know. I mean, I say I'm going to do it, and then I'll say like I'm running out of time. I'm 20, so who knows?
Yep. Well, I want to thank you so much for reaching out to us, because that's the absolute gift of the podcast, is that we get to meet amazing people that we wouldn't have met otherwise and get to have fantastic conversations. And I got to read a book that I absolutely love. And so thank you so much, Margo. And we will put all of your information, if you'd like to plug now, where the best place to buy your books or to reach you is.
Oh, the best place is probably bookshop.org, because they support independent booksellers.
Oh, okay.
Better than Amazon. I mean, it might be $1 or $2 more, but it's for a better cause.
Okay.
So I like to plug them. And thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun talking to you. And I have questions I have to ask you afterwards too that don't relate to doing, but to your research. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Do you want to give Margo's books one more time, Alison? Plug for her.
Yes, so the two books that are probably most relevant to what we were talking about tonight are called The Blue Tattoo, and that's the book that's about Olive Oatman, and then Bodies of Subversion, which she originally wrote in the 90s. And then there have been some revised editions, which you can get. Any of are good. If you like the history of tattooing, this is really essential reading. And then she also has a book, which I think she referenced in there, which is also segued out of tattooing, about the Miss America pageant.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she did mention that.
And that one is called Looking for Miss America.
All right. One of my favorite parts of the interview, and it's almost like it's just a little aside you guys were talking about, was that Olive Oatman's dress, the pattern was sort of to recall the tattoos on her face, and the photo that you had was perhaps to recall
the ones that you couldn't see.
The ones you couldn't see on her arms.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, odds are she probably made her own dress.
That's really, really neat. That's a really, really neat thing. Like, I just found that fascinating.
I think I read actually in Margo's book that in the photo I had, she has a big hairwork bracelet on, the tradition of weaving hair as a sentimental or mourning jewelry.
Yeah, which we've talked about at some point on the show. Yeah.
Yeah. Between the time I believe that she returned home and before she got married, she went to sort of like a finishing school, I think, or something like that. And it said she learned to make hairwork jewelry. So I thought that maybe that was from that time. It's kind of an interesting aside to that photo too.
Yeah, definitely.
Wonder whose hair it was.
Definitely. All right. Our curiosity of the week is not specifically on theme to women in tattoos, but it is really freaking cool.
It has a vague association to the theme.
In what sense? In it's powerful women?
No, I mean, it's not even that.
Oh, escaping.
Yes, these are the Athenian fugitives. So there
Gotcha.
are people escaping.
Right. This is a print. I guess this is an etching.
Or steel point engraving, maybe.
Engraving. Yeah, that's what I meant. An engraving. Yeah, I'm an artist. I know things. Yeah, it's an engraving.
You have a printmaking minor,
I
right?
do. Yeah. I just reached for the wrong word. This is fabulous. This print is, like, the quality of this print is stunning. And the variety of tones in this are, so it's a black and white engraving. It's really good.
It's from the 1870s. And
So time-wise, it's on point, too.
yeah, it's kind of after Olive came back.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does have some condition issues, and it's like
It's got some foxing.
it's got some foxing on it, but you can mat it out, and the actual image itself is in pretty good condition.
Yeah, it's just great. It's great.
Even the like, look at the shadows.
I know,
the
that's
shadows
what's
are like
so
its
impressive.
own. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's just I can't believe they were able to get that kind of detail from
Yes,
that technique in the 1870s.
In printmaking, I've done one of these. That's super impressive.
Yeah,
Like that, mine was not that impressive. I'll tell you that. It's really, really cool. This will be our curiosity of the week. I'll take a photo of this. I'll put it in the show notes. If you click on that, it'll take you to our Etsy shop where you can purchase this print and other curiosities of the week, those that are left. Also at Etsy, Strange Familiars t-shirts, stickers, patches. We got Strange Familiars mugs there. My books are there. If you get them from Etsy, they come signed. Don't even have to ask. I'll sign them before we put them in the boxes to send them. Alison has various ephemera there. I have artwork, originals, and prints. Check it all out. Our Etsy shop name is Lost Grave. So if you go to Etsy and you type in Lost Grave, one word, you should see our stuff come up. It'll also come up. There's a little thing that'll say, "Did you mean the shop, Lost Grave?" And
you'll say, "Of course I
you can
did."
click on that. There's links in the show notes. They'll take you right to the shop. Or if you type in Strange Familiars, our stuff will come up on Etsy as well. And I'd like to thank everybody who supports us on Etsy. That's another great way to help out the show. All right, let's go ahead and get this episode finally published. Not quite a week late. We're early in the week. But I think I'll be doing another episode for this week as well. So this is the makeup episode for missing last week. And another one should be coming later in this week. So thanks for listening, everybody. And we'll be back soon with more Strange Familiars. Strange Familiars is a production of Dark Holler Arts. Intro and background music is by Stone Breath. If you want to hear more or purchase music, you can go to stonebreath.bandcamp.com. Strange Familiars is on Facebook, facebook.com/strangefamiliars. We're on Instagram, @strangefamiliars, one word, no underscores. For Strange Familiars merch, you can go to strangefamiliars.com/merch and just take that /merch off. Strangefamiliars.com. It's open 24/7.
haunted by the voices of the dead. His brother likes to tell him that it's all up in his head. His mother kneels and prays, these words are never said. But little Timmy hears the voices of the dead. Timmy's haunted by the voices of the dead. His brother likes to tell him